The Memoirs of Casanova, Chapter 19. Early in November, I sold 50,000 francs worth of stock in my silk factory to a certain Monsignor Garnier. I received the money 3 days after signing the contract. But that very night, my warehouse man emptied my safe and fled. This was a heavy loss for me because my business was beginning to go badly. Then, to climax my misfortune, Garnier sent me a writ demanding that I give him back his 50,000 francs. I replied that I owed him nothing because the contract had already been duly signed and that, since he was a partner in the enterprise, the loss would have to be borne in common. But he insisted, and I was advised to take the case to court, which I did. Garnier began by declaring the contract null and void, and then he indirectly accused me of having pocketed the money, which I falsely claimed to have been stolen. I would have been glad to give him a sound thrashing to teach him better manners, but he was an old man, and it would not have made things any better. He seized everything in my factory and confiscated my horses, carriages, and other personal property. I was forced to dismiss all my employees. My lawyer was a dishonest scoundrel. In the course of the proceedings, Garnier sent me a writ ordering me to pay him. I immediately took it to my lawyer. He promised to appeal it the same day, but he did nothing of the sort. I continued to give him money, believing that he was using it to pay the expenses of my lawsuit, but he was actually keeping it for himself. He prevented two other writs from reaching me so that finally, without my having the slightest suspicion of what was taking place, a warrant for my arrest was issued. I was arrested at 8 o'clock in the morning as I was riding in my carriage on the Rue Saint Denis. I was taken to a rather clean cell. I told the jailer I had received only one writ.
"I'm not surprised,"
he replied,
"because such things happen often. But it is very hard to prove." "Bring me pen and paper and find me a reliable messenger."
I wrote to my lawyer, to Madame Durfey, and to all my friends. My lawyer wrote me a letter insisting that he had registered the appeal. Madame Durfey wrote me that she was expecting me for dinner. I assumed that she was mad because I could not believe that she would mock me. By 11 o'clock, my cell was full of people. But, no, by 11 o'clock, my cell was full of people. Poor Barrett came in weeping and offering me his entire shop. I was deeply touched by the good man. Finally, I was informed that a lady had come to see me. I waited, but no one entered. Impatient, I called the jailer, who told me She had left after asking for certain information. From his description, I easily guessed that it was Madame de Frey. I was extremely, it was extremely, it was extremely unpleasant to be deprived of my freedom. I thought of the Leeds, and although there was no real comparison between my present situation and my past imprisonment, I felt quite unhappy, for my arrest would probably discredit me everywhere in Paris. I had 30,000 francs in cash and jewelry worth twice that much, so I could have paid Garnier and been released without delay. But I could not make up my mind to such a sacrifice. At length, the jailer came back and said to me politely,
Monsignor, you are free now. And a lady is waiting for you outside in her carriage.
I called Leduc, my valet, and told him to see who the lady was. He returned. It was Madame de Frey. I took leave of all my visitors, and after 4 hours of an extremely disagreeable detention, I found myself free and in an elegant carriage. Madame de Frey received me with great dignity. I thanked her in a few words, telling her I was glad to be indebted to her, but that it was Garnier who had profited from her noble generosity. She replied with a pleasant smile that he would not profit from it so easily. As soon as I learned of your arrest, she said, I went to the jail and found out the reason for it. Then I deposited the amount you owed and had you released. If you are not in a position to go on with the lawsuit, Garnier will have to deal with me before he can get his hands on the deposit I have made. As for you, my friend, you ought to bring suit against your lawyer. It's obvious that he did not register your appeal and that he's been robbing you. My imprisonment disgusted me with Paris, and after I felt that way. My imprisonment disgusted me with Paris and gave me a hatred of lawsuits which is still with me. I was soon involved in a double labyrinth of chicanery with Garnier and my lawyer. Chicanery. With Garnier and my lawyer. It seemed to me that I was being led to torture each time I had to appear in court, spend my money on lawyers, and waste my precious time, which I believed to be well employed only in the pursuit of pleasure. In this violent state of mind, so out of harmony with my character, I decided to sell everything I owned and leave Paris. I moved out of my country house and withdrew the 80,000 francs I had put up as a bond for my lottery office on the Rue Saint Denis. I gave up the office to my head clerk as a gift. His wife's lover put up the bond for him. Not wishing to leave Madame de Frey to become entangled in a ridiculous lawsuit with Garnier, I went to Versailles to ask Abbé de la Ville, a close friend of his, to persuade him to accept a compromise. The abbé was glad to do so, especially since he had felt that his friend was in the wrong. A few days later, he wrote me that I could go to see Garnier, assuring me that I would find him willing to settle out of court. At first, Garnier was stubborn and demanding, but when I told him I was preparing to leave Paris, he realized that if Madame Dufresne took up the lawsuit, she could prolong it as long as she pleased, and that eventually he might lose it. This gave him food for thought. This gave him food for thought.
I have made up my mind,
He said.
I want 25,000 francs, or else I'll go on with the lawsuit until I die.
I told him Madame Dufresne's notary would pay him that sum as soon as he waived all claim to the 50,000 francs she had deposited as my bond. I was able to reconcile Madame Dufresne to this compromise only by telling her that my oracle demanded that I put all my affairs in order before leaving Paris, so that no one could accuse me of having fled in order to escape my creditors. I sold my horses, carriages, and furniture. I left Paris with 100,000 francs in bills of exchange and the same sum in jewelry. I was alone in my carriage. My valet, Le Duc, preceded me on horseback. This Le Duc was an 18-year-old Spaniard. He was very intelligent, and I was especially fond of him because he took care of my hair better than anyone else. I never refused him any pleasure I could procure for him by means of a little money. I spent 2 days in Brussels and then went directly to the Hague, Hague, where I stayed in the Prince of Orange Inn and asked the innkeeper who would be dining at his table. He told me there would be some officers of the Hanoverian army, some English ladies, and the Prince of Piccolomini and his wife. This made me decide to include myself in such good company. I sat down to the table and found that the group had been augmented by 2 Frenchmen who had just arrived. After the soup, one of them said deliberately,
The famous Casanova must be in Holland by now.
Yes, said the other.
I'd be glad to meet him and ask him for an explanation that would not be very pleasant for him.
I looked at this individual and, quite certain that I had never seen him before, I felt my face turning red with anger, but I controlled myself and calmly asked him if he knew Casanova.
Of course I know him,
he replied, in that tone of self-importance which is always displeasing.
No, Monsignor. You do not know him, because I am Casanova,
he replied insolently, without the slightest embarrassment.
You are terribly mistaken if you think you are the only Casanova in the world.
This was a skillful reply, and it put me in the wrong. I bit my lip and said nothing, but I felt deeply offended, and I was determined to make him acknowledge me as the Casanova who ought to be in Holland, and from whom he wanted to request a disagreeable explanation. The impudent young man, abusing the advantage which his victory appeared to give him, took the liberty of asking me what country I was from.
I am Venetian, Monsignor.
I replied.
Then you must be a good friend of the French, since your republic is under the protection of France.
At these words, I was able to restrain my irritation no longer. I told him scornfully that the Venetian Republic was strong enough never to have needed the protection of France or any other nation, and that in all the 13 centuries of its existence, it had had friends and allies, but never a protector.
In order to excuse your ignorance,
I added,
you will no doubt, answer that there's more than one Venetian republic in the world.
At this cutting remark, the other guests burst into spontaneous laughter, which dissipated my anger. The rash young Frenchman appeared disconcerted, and it was now his turn to bite his lip and remain silent. But his evil spirit restored his power to speech at dessert. The conversation, as usual, turned from one subject to another until finally someone mentioned Count Albemarle. An Englishman praised Lolette, his mistress. An Englishman praised Lolette, his mistress. I remarked that I had met the charming young lady in the house of the Duchess of Fulvi, and that no one had better deserved to acquire the title of Countess Aronville than she. Count Aronville, a lieutenant general and a man of letters, had recently married her. As soon as I said this, my Frenchman looked at me, laughed, and said I was right about Lolette's merit because he had made love with her in a house of prostitution. This was too much. I was choked with indignation and anger. I picked up my plate, held it as though I was going to throw it at his face, and said,
Insolent liar.
He stood up and went over to the fireplace. I went outside, certain that he would follow me if he had had any pride at all. When I was some distance away from the hotel, I turned around and saw him 50 paces behind me. When I reached the woods, I stopped in a clearing and prepared to meet my adversary. He was 10 paces away from me when he unsheathed his sword. So I had ample time to unsheath my own. The combat did not last long. As soon as he was within reach of my sword, my lunge, which has never failed me, sent him backward faster than he had approached. He was wounded in the chest, above the right breast. I lowered my sword and ran up to him, but he had no need of my help. He told me we would see each other again, and then he would have his revenge then. I did not see him again until 5 or 6 years later in Warsaw, and then only to take up a collection for him. I later learned that his name was Vanier. I do not know whether or not he was the same Vanier who was the latter president of the convention under the infamous Robespierre. Robespierre. I later learned that his name was Vanier. I do not know whether or not he was the same Vanier who was later president of the convention under the infamous Robespierre. When I returned to the inn after attending the theater, I learned that the Frenchman had spent an hour in his room with a surgeon and then left for Rotterdam with his companion. The supper was gay, the conversation was pleasant, and not a word was said about our quarrel. However, an English lady remarked that a man of honor ought never to sit down at an inn table without being prepared to fight a duel, in spite of all possible prudence. This was quite true in those days, because for a word taken amiss, a man had to unsheath his sword and expose himself to the disastrous consequences of a duel, or else people would point to him in scorn, even the ladies. Having nothing to do in the Hague, I left for Amsterdam at dawn the next morning. In Amsterdam, I decided to go on to Germany. I stopped briefly in Utrecht and reached Cologne the next day without difficulty, but not without danger, for when I was less than 2 miles outside the city, 5 deserters aimed their guns at me and shouted,
Your money or your life.
I took out my pistol, pointed it at my coachman, and threatened to shoot him if he did not set off at a gallop. The bandits shot at my carriage without wounding anyone. The Duke was amazed at not having been hit by any of the bullets that whistled past his ears. The French army had taken up winter quarters in Cologne. I stayed in the Golden Sun Inn, where the first person I met was Count Lastic, Madame Dufray's nephew. He gave me a friendly welcome and offered to introduce me to Monsignor de Torchi, the commanding officer of the French forces in Cologne. I was glad to accept. When I told Monsignor de Torchi what had just happened to me on the road, he congratulated me on the fortunate outcome of my encounter, but with military frankness, he reproached me somewhat for the use I had made of my courage.
You took a great risk to save your money,
he said.
But it might have cost you a limb, and nothing could have compensated you for that.
I replied that to brave a danger is often to diminish it. We laughed, and then he told me that if I was in no hurry to leave, he could probably give me the pleasure of seeing the bandits hanged. I intend to leave tomorrow, I told him.
And if anything could retain me in Cologne, it certainly would not be a desire to witness the execution of a band of wretched bandits. That kind of amusement is not at all to my taste.
Count Lastic invited me to dinner and then persuaded me to go to the theater with him and his friend Monsignor de Savancourt, a very likable officer. Certain that I would be introduced to some ladies and wishing to make a good impression during my brief stay. Certain that I would be introduced to some ladies and wishing to make a good impression during my brief stay, I spent an hour dressing and grooming myself. I sat in a box opposite a pretty woman who stared at me several times. It would have taken less than that to make me curious, and I asked Count Lastic to introduce me to her, which she was introducing me to General Kettler, an Austrian lieutenant general who was staying in the headquarters of the French army, just as the French general Montacet was staying in the headquarters of the Austrian army. She received me with a gracious smile and asked me questions about Paris and Brussels, but she was so interested in my lace and jewelry that she hardly seemed to hear my replies. Then, after we had talked of various trifles, as people usually do when they meet each other for the first time, she abruptly asked me how long I intended to stay in Cologne.
I plan to cross the Rhine tomorrow,
I said,
and I'll probably have dinner in Bonn.
This reply, which I uttered in a tone as indifferent as the one in which she had asked her question, appeared to upset her. I took this as a good omen. General Kettler stood up and said to me,
Monsignor, I'm sure Madame will convince you to delay your departure, and that will make me happy if it gives me a chance to become better acquainted with you.
I bowed, and he went off with Lastic, leaving me alone with the ravishing beauty. She was the wife of the Burgomaster of Cologne, and General Kettler was almost always in her company. Was the general mistaken in attributing such power to me? She asked with a winsome smile.
I don't think so, Madame. But he may be mistaken in assuming that you will want to use it.
We will have to punish him for his indiscretion. Stay. Taking on an expression of resignation and gratitude, I bowed and kissed her hand. You'll stay then, Monsignor? She said. It is very kind of you, because if you left tomorrow, we might have believed you'd come here only to show your disdain for us. The general is giving a ball tomorrow, and I hope you'll dance with me.
I dare hope, Madame, dare I hope that you'll dance all evening with me.
I'll dance with no one but you. until you become tired.
Then you'll dance with no one else. You will dance with no one else.
The door opened and the general entered.
I'm sure,
He said,
that Madame has persuaded you to delay your departure and come to my ball. How could I resist, General? You're right, and I'm grateful to her for retaining you.
When I left the box, I was in love and full of hope. The next day, I had dinner with Monsignor de Castries, and all of the guests were surprised that General Kettler had invited me to his ball, since he was extremely jealous of their Burgomaster's wife, who tolerated his attentions only because they flattered her self-esteem. The general was middle-aged. He was not at all handsome, and since his mental qualities were much too unimpressive to compensate, he was not at all the kind of man with whom a woman is likely to fall in love. In spite of his jealousy, however, he had to look on uncomplainingly while I sat next to the burgomaster's wife during supper and danced with her during the entire ball. I spent a delightful evening, and I went home so smitten with my new acquaintance that I no longer had any thought of leaving. The next day I went to pay her a visit. She gave me a very good reception and introduced me to her husband. He was neither young nor handsome, but he was quite obliging. An hour later, we heard the general's carriage pull up outside, and she hastened to say to me, "If the general asks you if you intend to go to Bonn for the elector's ball, tell him you do." The general came in, and after the customary civilities, I left. I had not known that the elector was giving a ball, and I still did not know when it was to take place, but it did not take me long to find out about it. I naturally decided to go, for my charming lady would be there, and I had a right to hope for a happy encounter with her. I hurried to Bonn and rented a room there. The elector's ball was quite enjoyable. We were all dressed as peasants. My lady looked ravishing in her costume. We soon danced a dance in which, during a certain step, each gentleman seizes a lady and kisses her. I was not at all reserved. Each time I managed to find myself opposite my lady, and I kissed her ardently. The elector laughed heartily while General Kettler nearly choked with rage. I returned to Cologne in time to see the play being given by a troupe of French actors. I went to the theater in a sedan chair. As soon as I arrived, I saw Count Lastic alone with the burgomaster's wife. I was encouraged by this, and I went over to them. She told me sadly that the general was ill and had been obliged to go to bed. A few minutes later, Count Lastic left us, and she dropped her false air of sadness.
Allow me to tell you that I am much more gravely ill than General Kettler,
I said to her. I hope you're joking.
Not at all. The kisses I had the good fortune to steal from you at the ball have inflamed my blood, and if you are not humane enough to give me the only possible remedy, I'll leave here unhappy for the rest of my life.
Do not leave yet. I'm thinking of you. Believe me, and I do not want to disappoint you, but it is difficult to find an opportunity.
If you did not have the general's carriage tonight, and if I had my own, I could take you home in all decency.
That's true, but since you do not have your carriage, I will be the one to take you home. It is an excellent idea, but it must not look as though we have planned it in advance. You'll offer me your arm to take me to my carriage. I'll ask you where yours is. You will tell me you did not bring it. I'll invite you to get into mine, and then I'll take you home. We'll have only a few minutes alone together, but until we have a better opportunity, it will be better than nothing. I answered her only with a look that expressed all the intoxication with which the hope of winning her love made me feel. The play, which was actually quite short, seemed to last a century. Finally, the curtain came down and we went outside. When we reached her carriage, she asked me the questions we had already agreed upon, and when I told her I had no carriage, she said to me, I'm going to the general's house to ask about his health. If it's not too long a ride for you, I can take you home on the way back. This was an inspired idea. We would have to make 2 complete trips across the long and badly paved city, and we would therefore have much more time together. Unfortunately, however, she had an open carriage, and on the way to the general's house, the moon shone directly in our faces. We did what we could, but it amounted to almost nothing. To make matters worse, the insolent and curious coachman occasionally turned his head around, which forced us to moderate our movements still more. At the general's house, we were told that he was not receiving any visitors. We set out for my house full of joy, for the moon was now behind us, and the coachman's curiosity was less bothersome. We did a little better or rather, a little less badly than before. But it seemed to me that the horses fairly flew over the pavement. I went home exhausted and unhappy, but more in love than ever, for she had convinced me that she was not at all passive, and that the pleasure she felt was as intense as that which she gave. I went to the general's house the next day at noon. She was already there. I addressed him, a compliment appropriate to the circumstances, but the crude Austrian's only reply was a rather cold nod. 2 days later, I learned that she was feeling indisposed. I went to see her at 11 o'clock in the morning, certain that I would not find the general there. She received me in the bedroom of her husband, who cordially invited me to stay for dinner. I thanked him and accepted with pleasure. The burgomaster was a pleasant, rather intelligent man with an excellent education. He liked to have a peaceful household. He liked to have a peaceful household, and his wife was necessarily fond of him because he was not one of those husbands who say, "Displease everyone else as long as you please me." When her husband left us for a short time, she showed me through the whole house. "Here's our bedroom," she said, "and here's a little room where I sleep alone during the 5 or 6 days each month when decency requires it. Here's a public church which we can almost regard as our chapel, because we can hear the Mass through these two grilled windows. On Sunday, we go down this staircase and enter the church through a door to which I always have the key. The next day, I went to Mass in the little church. It was a Sunday, so I saw my lady with her husband and children. I observed the little door. It opened toward the staircase. The devil, who, as is well known, has more power in a church than anywhere else, inspired me with a plan to enjoy the favors of the burgomaster's wife by passing through that little door. I told her of my idea the next day at the theater.
I had the same
the same
idea.
idea. She said, laughing. And I'll give you written instructions as to how to carry it out. You will find them in the first newspaper I hand you. We were unable to continue our delightful conversation because visitors began to enter her box at that moment. I did not have long to wait. The next day, she publicly handed me a newspaper, telling me there was nothing interesting in it. I knew it would be extremely interesting for me. However, here is what her note contained. Here is what her note contained. The excellent plan, inspired by love, is not difficult, but it is subject to several uncertainties. The wife sleeps in the small bedroom only when her husband asks her to, which happens only at certain times of the month. That time is not far off, but her husband is accustomed to her, and she cannot deceive him about the date. It is therefore necessary to wait, and you will be notified when the hour of happiness has arrived. You will hide in the church, and you must not try to bribe the man who locks and unlocks it, because although he is poor, he is too stupid to be corrupted, and would betray the secret. He locks the doors of the church at noon on weekdays. On Sundays and holidays, he locks it at sundown and unlocks it at dawn. When the time comes, you will have only to push open the little door opening onto the staircase. It will not be locked that day. I kissed this charming note 100 times. And the next day I went to the church to reconnoiter. I decided I would hide in the confessional. If I lay down in the place where the confessor put his feet, I could not be seen. But the space was so small that at first I was not sure I would be able to fit into it. I waited until noon, and then, as soon as the church was empty, I tried it out. I found that I could not lie down. I had to curl up into a ball, and I was so badly hidden that anyone who happened to pass by could easily see me. But I did not hesitate, because in order to carry out such maneuvers successfully, one must always count on chance to a certain extent. Determined to run every risk, I went home satisfied with my discoveries. A week later, the Burgomaster's wife informed the general in my presence that her husband was leaving for La Chapelle the next day and would not be back for 3 days. She gave me a glance which told me I was to take advantage of the opportunity. The next day was fortunately a holiday, so that I was able to hide in the confessional at sundown, thereby avoiding a painful wait of several hours. It was 4 o'clock when I crouched in the confessional, hiding myself as best I could and calling on all the saints to protect me. At 5 o'clock, the beadle left the church and locked the door. As soon as I heard the sound of his key, I left my narrow prison and sat down on a bench opposite the windows. A quarter of an hour later, I pushed open the little door, went through it, groped my way to the staircase, and sat down on it. I waited for 5 hours, which, with my expectations of happiness, would not have seemed painful to me if I had not been horribly tormented by the rats that were constantly scurrying across the floor. Nature has given me an invincible repugnance for those little animals. They are not very dangerous, but their odor nauseates me. At exactly 10 o'clock, the object of my desires appeared with a candle in her hand. If the reader has had similar experiences, he will be able to imagine all the pleasures of that wonderful night. But he will not guess the details because while I was an expert on the subject, my partner had an inexhaustible means of increasing the delights of our exercise. She had prepared a little supper, which looked delicious, but I did not touch it because I had another kind of appetite which I was able to satisfy only by constantly enjoying her beauty. We were occupied with our pleasures for 7 hours, which seemed short to me even though we took no rest, except to season our voluptuous rapture with sweet words. Her husband was incapable of a great passion, but his robust temperament was enough to make him do his conjugal duty with her every night. He suspended his rights during her monthly periods, however, and to preserve himself from temptation, he insisted that she sleep in another room. Exhausted, but not sated, I left her at dawn, assuring her she would find me the same the next time we met. I went back into the church and hid in the confessional, fearing that the beadle might see me in the early light of day, but I managed to leave without difficulty. I spent nearly the entire day in bed, and that evening I went to the theater to see the charming lady whom love and persistence had placed in my possession. 2 weeks later, she slipped me a note informing me that she would sleep alone the following night. It was a weekday, and since the church would be open only until noon, I went there at 11 o'clock after having eaten a copious breakfast. I hid myself in my hole, and the beadle locked the door without seeing me. I had 10 hours ahead of me. I was not amused when I reflected that I would have to spend part of the time in a corner of the church and the rest on the staircase in the company of a swarm of rats. But the thought of my reward made these difficulties seem trivial. Toward 1 o'clock, however, I heard a slight noise and saw a hand pass through the grill and drop a piece of paper on the floor of the church. My heart pounded as I ran over to pick it up, because my first thought was that some obstacle had presented itself. But I was filled with joy when I read the following. The door is unlocked. You will be more comfortable on the staircase, where you will find a candle, a little dinner, and some books. You may be sure that the time will seem shorter to you than to me. I have told the general that I feel indisposed and will not go out today. May God preserve you from coughing, because that would betray us both. I entered and found a delicious dinner, complete with wine and coffee and a number of amusing books. I was amazed that she had been able to place everything there without being seen by anyone in her family. I spent 3 hours reading and 3 more eating and drinking. I then went to sleep. At 10 o'clock, my angel came to awaken me. This second night together was sweet, but much less so than the first one, because we were deprived of the pleasure of seeing each other and hampered in our amorous struggles by the nearby presence of her husband. We slept for part of the night, and I prudently withdrew early the next morning. That was the end of my affair with her. The general left for Westphalia, and she was soon obliged to move to the country. I therefore left Cologne, promising her I would come back to see her the following year, a promise which I was unable to keep.